For a season, you were the leading psychologist in the world talking about what was taking place during this COVID-19 pandemic, or I like to just call it situation.
The COVID crisis was actually the first major leap forward in the emergence of a technocratic surveillance system. So what we are witnessing now, I think, is the emergence of a fully fledged new totalitarian system.
The warning to leaders is to recognize if you were duped by this, be ready for the next thing coming.
I truly believe truth exists, but I really doubt whether science will tell us what the truth is. The only resistance, the only remedy for mass formation is sincere, truthful speech. Inevitably, the one who speaks the truth will be hated.
Mattias Desmet, it is such a privilege to sit down with you today. Thank you for being with us on UnderCurrent.
Thank you for having me on, Gabe.
Yeah, so you're the author of the Psychology of Totalitarianism. You've described a theory that we're going to get into here in a minute around mass formation, but I personally just want to thank you. During these last few years, you've been a voice of reason, clarity. You've helped so many leaders like myself better understand what was happening in our society as we went through the COVID-19 era, and we'll talk a little bit more about unpacking and looking back and reflecting on what was happening there. But I want to begin with helping people better understand just your background, your career, where this began for you, the type of work that you do, where you actually have expertise. And then I want to jump into some of these very specific examples of how we're experiencing psychological challenges as a society.
Okay, good. Yes. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And back in 2003, I had the opportunity to do a PhD at Ghent University in Belgium. And that's where it all started. Maybe much earlier, but yeah. That's the easiest point to situate the starting point. And I started to do a PhD, and I was supposed to do a PhD in which I would do a classical research investigating the associations between personality and depression. And as scholars usually do in psychology, you first measure the personality traits and the depressive symptoms, and then you compute statistical correlations between the two to know whether or not there is a correlation between personality and depression. So I started to do that, and I noticed from the beginning that these so-called measures, like psychological tests, they actually contain too much error just to use for statistical inference. Like if you measure the same psychological characteristic, like a personality trait, with 3 different psychological tests, the results are completely different. Correlation is often close to 0. And after like 2 or 3 months, I just went to my promoter and I said, I don't want to do such research. I wouldn't believe myself what I would write in my papers. And I asked them permission to investigate the quality of psychological research instead. And I'm still very grateful that I could do it. And I after a few years, I published a little book, The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology, which really took a deep dive into the problems with research in the field of psychology, which are enormous. And then, during the same period, the so-called replication crisis started in the sciences. And it's so important to be aware of that crisis, because that crisis showed that this problem that I had been investigating was not limited to the field of psychology, as I also thought in the beginning, but that it's everywhere. Like in most fields of academic research, up to 85% of the papers cannot be reproduced. That means that they are completely worthless from a scientific point of view.
So people are doing studies and they're essentially extrapolating a lot of ideas, saying it's science.
Yeah.
People believe it,
yeah.
But it's not. They can't replicate it.
They can't. It's not only that they cannot replicate it; they cannot reproduce it. That means if they give the same data set to 2 different researchers, the conclusions will be completely different. That means that they cannot be reproduced, the findings, which is much worse than that they cannot be replicated. And then the most important paper was written about this problem was written by John Ioannidis, a Stanford professor. I think he was the professor with the most scientific publications, and he wrote this paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, in which he described that problem. They are almost all false, or the vast majority is false.
85%, right?
Well, of 85%, you can prove that they are false. But the remaining 15% might be false without us being able to prove it. So
Well, what does this mean?
There is good research as well. There is good research.
I know, but how do we know?
But
it feels like then
that's a problem.
It feels very postmodern. Like there's nothing we can trust.
Yes.
All of it's deconstructed. But this is the crisis you're describing.
I truly believe truth exists, and that's why I resist postmodernism. But I really doubt whether science will tell us what the truth is. That's a different thing.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Yes.
Because our current age, of course, has relied so much on scientism.
Yes,
the belief that science is the answer to all truth.
Yeah, of course. But that brings us straight to the essence of the problem of our Enlightenment culture, I think. Because a few centuries ago, we started to believe that observing the world with our eyes, establishing the fact through our senses, and then establishing rational connections between the facts established with the senses would be the royal road to truth. That's what we started to believe. But all major scientists, all seminal scientists, which usually are completely different people than most academic researchers, all seminal sciences rejected that idea. They said the essence of life, the real world, Max Planck said, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, one of the most wonderful people of the Enlightenment culture, I think. The real world, he said, cannot be observed with your eyes.
Yeah.
The real world always transcends the world you see with your eyes. And, he said, in the real world, it's not a causal law that is important, it's an ethical law that is important. So there is a world that transcends everything we can see with our eyes and understand with our brain. In that world is an ethical world. Yeah. And he describes it in a wonderful book. And Einstein also said the most strangest things, if you look at them from the mainstream perspective. He said, the real scientist is a truly religious person, he said. So it's very strange. He describes that in his text, Religion and Science. But he said, and that's also important, he said, but I don't believe in a personal God. So Einstein didn't believe in a personal God. He didn't believe in a personal God, and he didn't believe in a God with human-like characteristics. But people like Heisenberg did.
Yeah.
Heisenberg did. So it's a very interesting theological discussion.
Like Isaac Newton and Galileo. I mean, you go back in the ages, there were those who, and that's what's been beautiful to watch, at least from me, observing our current culture. It seems like the smartest, most intellectual among us are starting to find their way back to the belief that there is a God, that there is a design, that it is above what science can even tell us. Although science helps us. I mean, science, I believe science is always helping us learn more about the order in which God's designed the universe.
True science helps us.
Yeah.
Definitely. And then because I think it shows that the essence of nature and of existence transcends rational understanding. Like we shouldn't go too deep into that, but like complex dynamical systems theory, which is I believe the most subtle and sophisticated scientific theory at the moment, a theory which emerged in the second half of the 20th century, complex dynamical systems theory, showed exactly this. There's all complex dynamical systems behave literally like an irrational number, literally. So we won't go into the structure of irrational numbers, but literally it shows that the essence of things is supra-rational, that it transcends rationality. And so we stumble upon a paradox there. Science shows, in a strictly rational way, that the essence of life is strictly irrational. So that's a paradox. As Niels Bohr said, all real truth, he said, is a paradox, meaning it transcends logical thinking.
Okay, so I want to talk about your theory of mass formation. Over the last few years, that became a topic of conversation. I mean, everywhere from the Joe Rogan Experience to Fox News to Forbes Magazine, New York Post. I mean, for a season, you were the leading psychologist in the world talking about what was taking place during this COVID-19 pandemic, or I like to just call it situation, because we all experienced a lot of psychological anxiety, fear, people telling us what we needed to do. We'll get into that, but you started to articulate a theory of here's what I see happening right now as you observed that at least first year of the COVID-19 situation happening. So could you first describe what is a theory of mass formation? And then we can apply it to maybe what we all experienced during the last few years so people listening and watching this can start to understand how does it apply to a real world situation and why should we be so aware of not being formed like into groupthink, because that's essentially mass formation is how does groupthink set in on a population? Yep. So share more about the theory.
Yes. A few years before the corona crisis, I started to investigate that phenomenon already. And I started to think about the related phenomenon of totalitarianism. And it's extremely important to understand the relationship, because what we are witnessing now, I think, is the emergence of a fully fledged new totalitarian system. Like, the most important thing is this, that people often confuse totalitarian systems with classical dictatorships, and that's something completely different. In a classical dictatorship, people are just scared of the dictatorial regime, and that's why they just accept that this dictatorial regime top-down imposes its a social contract to the population. But in a totalitarian state is something completely different. In a totalitarian state, in the first stage of the emergence of a totalitarian state, you first have the emergence of a mass formation. That means a kind of group formation where people very fanatically start to believe in a certain ideology. And so fanatically, this group formation has very specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. First, and the first thing is that people who are in the grip of a mass formation are not capable anymore of taking a critical distance of what the group believes in. Second, people who are in the grip of a mass formation are, in a strange way, radically willing to self-sacrifice everything. Also the health and of their children, the future of their children. Doesn't matter. In a mass formation, individual identity and the awareness of individual interests is completely replaced by group identity. Completely. Everyone, mass formation uniformizes. It puts everyone in the same uniform, literally and metaphorically. And then the third characteristic is that in a mass formation, people start to become radically intolerant for everyone who thinks differently, to the extent that if a mass formation lasts long enough, people will report everyone to the state who doesn't go along with the masses. Even a child will report its own parents, and a parent its own children. I had this conversation with Shoref Eshtali. You can still find it on the internet. She was a woman of the upper class of Iran who lived there during the revolution of 1978, which actually was a huge mass formation. She was forced to witness how a mother who reported her son to the state put the noose around the neck of her son when he was on the scaffold, and when he died, she was proud to receive a medal for heroineship. That's a dramatic last stage of a mass formation, and this mass formation, this process of mass formation, has always existed, but the last few centuries it became stronger and stronger and stronger, And it had to do with a few things. In the first place, the loneliness in the population, which increased. And in the second place, because throughout the last few hundreds of years, leaders relied more and more on a kind of manipulative speech which we call propaganda and which they disseminate through mass media. And it's the combination of these two things, the increasing loneliness and the development of propaganda, which together make that mass formation can last longer, become bigger, and become the basis of a new state system which is much more destructive than a classical dictatorship, because it has a huge secret police at its disposal, namely this part of the population, which so fanatically believes in the narrative that they are willing to report their own children to the state. Yeah. That's the problem.
And those two things come together. Usually the propaganda is designed to create fear and anxiety amongst the population, which makes them long for someone to just give them the answer, someone to tell them, how are we supposed to respond to this situation so that they can remove some of that anxiety? And I think we all experienced that during the COVID situation, where we had great fear put out that everybody was, like a lot of people were going to die. We needed to all take certain measures to move away from death by distancing ourselves, not going to schools, not gathering in groups, churches shutting down. We saw a lot of directives telling people, if you do these things, you will be safe. And that, for me, was the first clue to something psychological going on, because I started to see friends, people I've known for decades that I trust, responding to this in very different ways. Some people were happy to go along with whatever they were being told for fear. And there were others that were starting to ask some bigger questions. Why are we doing this? Does any of this make sense? And you still, to this day, you could see this divide start to happen in the population, where some people were happy to move along with whatever they were told, and half who were saying, I'm not going along with this. So what are the differences in the two mentalities when presented with something like this that you start to see play out? What's the person more conditioned for it? How are they responding? And the person who's resisting it, what is it about their psychological makeup that makes them pose questions and resist?
Nobody knows. We can
no science research that can be repeated, right?
Yes, I describe that a little bit in my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. But we are going into the mechanics of the mass formation. That's very important, I think. We should go into it because it's so important to understand how it works.
Yeah.
Because once you understand that it works, you also see that the only thing, the only resistance, the only way, the only remedy for mass formation is sincere, truthful speech. So it's extremely important to understand it.
Yeah.
Shall we go into it a little bit?
Yeah, huh? I think we should. I mean, I'd like to say this first. You gave us this theory that I think helps everybody understand over decades how a population can start to have groupthink. And I think at least for those in America, those in the West, you can look back now over a couple of decades and see a slow path, a slow journey towards people starting to adopt some of these ideologies that we're all part of one group, that individual identity isn't necessarily as important, and sacrificing even some of your own convictions to placate to someone else who has ideas that maybe you disagree with. And you can see the slow movement towards people just starting to be quiet about things that they in their heart and their conviction disagree on. But it set the stage for that moment. So yes, let's get into the mechanics of it so people can recognize it. And I think the COVID situation is a perfect one to help us understand how this works.
I also think the COVID situation is the best example, contemporary example. It was the first global mass formation and the first big mass formation since the Second World War, I think.
Yeah.
There is a lot of process of massification, which are milder forms of mass formation, but the COVID crisis was the first real mass formation, I think. And as I like from the first week of the crisis onwards, I knew that there was something wrong, because I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but I'm also a statistician by training. So I also have a master degree in statistics, and I looked at the statistics on the mortality rates of the virus, and I said they are wrong, completely wrong. And there were several other statisticians much more famous than I was who said exactly the same. It's wrong. The virus is at least 10 times less dangerous than the statistics claim. In the first week of the crisis, I published my first opinion paper titled "The Fear of the Virus is more dangerous than the virus itself.
Yeah.
It went viral in Belgium and Holland. And in that paper, I just said, like, okay, it's 10 times less dangerous, probably. And like 5 months later or something, no, 3 months later, in May 2020, it was clear beyond a shade of a doubt that indeed the statistics had been completely wrong and that my predictions were quite accurate. Like for instance, in Sweden, the statistics predicted that by the end of May 2020, 60,000 people would die if the country didn't go into lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
Sweden didn't go into lockdown. 6,000 people died,
Mm-hmm.
10%. And even the people who published the original statistics admitted in a hearing before the British House of Commons that they had been wrong. So,
Yeah.
but, and that's an interesting thing, the narrative in the media just continued.
Yeah.
And people continued to buy into it. And that was when it took me some time, strangely enough, while I had been studying mass formation and totalitarianism for years, to understand that the mass formation was going on.
Right.
It shows that everyone, to a certain extent, or at least almost everyone, is in the grip. And then for months, I suddenly became aware, but this is a mass formation. And I started to think, I think for 6 or 7 weeks, how I could explain to the people what a mass formation is like, but in a 1,500 words paper, like short and accessible. And I had 100 times I believed like that it would never work. And then suddenly one night I woke up, got this idea, and I said, that's how I can explain it. And then, so the idea is simply this, like I showed that I connected all kinds of evolutions that happened throughout the last centuries in our society. I connected them with each other. Like, first, everyone knows that at least for 200 or 300 years, more and more people started to feel lonely. And like in a Gallup World Poll of 2017, in between 40 and 60% of the people worldwide reported to feel so lonely that they didn't have one meaningful relationship. Mm-hmm. And then, as a consequence, and that's the things that I connected with each other, like as soon as people feel lonely, something else will happen as well. They will start to feel as if their life is without purpose. A human being has a spontaneous feeling of meaning and purpose in life if it sees, as Emmanuel Levinas describes, when it feels that its existence has an effect on the face of the other. We want to see that we touch the other. And if we do, we spontaneously feel that our life makes sense,
right.
that it has that we have a reason to be here, that our existence has a certain purpose. And so between 40 to 60% of the people feels lonely and disconnected. In between 40 and 60 people also feels as if, for instance, their job is a bullshit job. Graeber wrote a wonderful book about that, in which he said, like, most people, it's baffling how many people feel that their job is completely without purpose. So there are, like, loneliness and lack of purpose are like the most widespread psychological problems and are the basis of many other psychological conditions. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as you feel disconnected, lonely, and as soon as and struggle with lack of meaning making and purpose, something very important will happen at the level of affective life and emotions. You will typically start to be confronted with what I called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. Mm-hmm. That means a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression in which you don't know what you feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. And this is an extremely aversive mental state. Mm-hmm. People have always been anxious, maybe even more than now. But they were under the illusion that they knew what they were anxious for. And in contemporary society, there are high levels of free-floating anxiety where people don't know it. And if people are in this state, if many people are in this state, and someone distributes a narrative through the mass media indicating an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, something baffling might happen. All this free-floating anxiety might at once connect to the object of anxiety, and people might be willing to participate in the strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, even if that strategy is utterly absurd. That's what happens. That's the first step in the emergence of totalitarian states. Suddenly, everyone is scared of the Jews. Suddenly, everyone is scared of the aristocracy, as it happened in the Soviet Union. Suddenly, everyone is scared of the witches. Suddenly, everyone is scared of the virus, even if they haven't seen anybody die in their environment. Some, of course, people died. There was a virus. It was dangerous to a certain extent. It's not about that. But it was overrated and tackled with it in a completely counterproductive way. So, but that's the first step of a mass formation. All the free-floating anxiety connects to the object of anxiety, and people participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. The reason why they do it is simple, because it makes them feel in control again.
Yeah, this makes so much sense. I hope everybody listening to the description you just gave is following along, because this is deep. I mean, this is complex ways of understanding what's happening at a societal level. But I'll never forget, I think it was November of 2021, hearing a long interview with you where you were describing all of this. And I know in my own life as a leader, I was trying to process through what is happening. I was trying to make sense of it. I knew something was off. I knew that there needed to be truth put on the table because falsehood was going forward. And you started to describe this and it connected with me. I started to understand this is what's happening. It finally was making sense. And so in the case of the COVID situation, you have a virus presented. Of course, there was a virus. You then have the reaction, which is to tell everybody with their anxiety that they could die to stay home, don't go to work, don't connect with other people, get lonelier basically, and then you'll be okay. And then hang on, because we have a vaccine coming that's going to be the answer. And then we saw this rollout of a vaccine that everyone was told, you must take this vaccine or you're going to die or other people are going to die. So continued control tactics. But the free-floating anxiety that you just described, everybody's feeling that. Now we have a solution. The solution must be, if we get the vaccines, everyone will be okay. My anxiety can go away. And we saw multiple people get vaccines. They didn't understand the science of it. We weren't told at all what the science was. There wasn't research that was laid out that was explaining whether it was actually safe and effective. The lie went forward that this was safe and effective. The lie went forward that this actually will help stop the spread. And now we're looking back over the last few years, and a lot of people regrettably followed along with that advice. And now there's suffering that's happening because they're realizing that wasn't true. So as you watch that rollout of the vaccine, I want to talk specifically about that solution that was offered. How did you start to see that play out? And did you notice as well the reporting was starting to happen? You had friends reporting on other friends saying, hey, they need to get vaccinated, or you can't come to work, or you can't come in this restaurant. Like, the population starts to turn on itself, right? Because whoever wasn't following along, the dissidents in this case, were going to be labeled the problem. I mean, we even had our president, Joe Biden, say that, right? If you don't get vaccinated, you're killing people. That was the pressure put on this particular tactic.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, the vaccine for most people functioned as a ritual without them being aware of it. So when a mass formation emerges, it always imposes rituals. Like, we just went into the first step of the mass formation, like how all the free-floating anxiety is connected to the object of anxiety in the narrative, and people participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, such as vaccination is one aspect of a strategy. But then there is a second step, and that's even more important, because in a second step, something even more powerful happens, because so many people at the same time start to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. They have the feeling that they fight a heroic collective battle. So they have the feeling that they are connected again and that they escaped the root cause of the problem, the loneliness. And that's why they reacted in such an enthusiastic way.
Right.
Nurses were dancing in the hospitals, and there was this dangerous virus, but they were dancing, clapping their hands in the hospital. People were in a strange state of enthusiasm, which is typical for people who escape a state of loneliness. And that's where they start to become convinced that everyone who doesn't participate in the enthusiasm lacks citizenship, is not a human being, and in the end should be excommunicated. That's what we all went through, at least people who didn't get vaccinated. I couldn't go in the restaurant anymore, couldn't go in many spaces in public space, was not allowed to eat in a student restaurant anymore at university, couldn't travel anymore. So that's the first step. But if this state of mass formation lasts longer, inevitably people start to be convinced that it is their ethical duty to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with the mass formation. So you have this strange thing. People start to participate, have the feeling that they fight this collective heroic battle, and that they are not lonely anymore. They have that feeling, but they are even more lonely. That's crucial to understand.
Yeah.
Because in a mass formation, the mass formation is a kind of group formation that is completely different of other kinds of group formation. In a mass formation, or a mass emerges not because individuals connect to each other, not because individuals feel solidarity or love for each other. A mass formation emerges because each individual separately connects to a collective ideal, feels there's all solidarity that used to exist between people, all love between individuals is sucked away from the bond between individuals and is all injected in the bond between the individual and the collective.
Wow.
Meaning that is in a mass, the solidarity with the collective, after a while, becomes much stronger than the solidarity with other individuals. That's why mothers report in the end of this process their children to the state. And that's why in the corona crisis, everyone was talking about solidarity and still accepted that if another human being got an accident and was bleeding on the street, we were no longer allowed to help that person because we had to be loyal to the collective ideal.
Yeah.
And when parents were dying in hospitals, children accepted that they were not allowed to visit their parents. That's what I mean with the solidarity and the love between individuals, which disappears completely without people being aware of it, even being convinced of the opposite, that they are the only ones who represent citizenship and love in society.
No, that's, I mean, what a great description, because that's what happened. We have families who rejected their children coming for Thanksgiving because they were so afraid they were going to get sick or if they weren't vaccinated. Relationships were broken. I mean, at the tightest bonds. My mother passed away in a hospital where for the last week of her life, no one was allowed to come into the hospital. I had to work very hard to get my father into the hospital, threatening lawsuits to the administrator of the hospital. So my father, who for 53 years had been married to my mother, could actually sit by her bedside and see her. And thankfully, that was able to happen for the last 48 hours of her life. But these are the kinds of things a society can do. And the reason I wanted to talk about this with you is we're kind of coming through COVID-19. We saw people speak truth. We are so fortunate that there were courageous people like yourself. I think of Peter McCullough. I think of Aaron Cariotti. I think of many, many more. I can't even list the names who did incredible work. Aaron Siri. So many people who did incredible work to expose the corruption, to expose the lie, to expose that there wasn't actually science and research, to expose that these weren't actually vaccines, that this was more like gene therapy. And that's still coming out, and more is going to come out. But I think the warning to leaders is to recognize if you were duped by this, be ready for the next thing coming, because this type of totalitarian thinking is a way I believe spiritually the enemy works, and we've seen it work throughout civilizations. That allows people to come in. And we know fear in the Christian story. We understand fear is something the enemy, Satan, pushes into a population. This is his tool. Whereas for people of faith, it's faith. And so we fight faith with fear. We have faith and a hope and a joy and something better, a redemption, renewal. But when he wins by instilling fear into a population, what comes after that? Destruction, division, death. And that's what I think we have narrowly avoided in some ways. There was still a lot of death. There's still a lot of fallout. As we look to the future, speak to your feelings about those who were willing to speak up, because that's the key. And I know you're working on a new project called the Psychology of Truth, and that the only way we defeat this is there's people willing to tell the truth. They're willing to stand, and you did that, and I bet it was incredibly lonely. I bet academically and in the institutions you were rejected, but you were willing to do that and help people understand why it's so important that they not lose that conviction in these moments, even when they start to feel alone. so that they can fight against these types of narratives forming the masses.
Yes. Yeah, Hannah Arendt, the most important philosopher and author on totalitarianism, said it's the ultimate evil because it tries to destroy the soul of the human being. I wrote an article about that, the desouling of the world.
And we'll link to that in the show notes, as well as the articles you've referenced earlier, so people can go deeper.
There's
there.
also Suicidal Society is also maybe a good one to link to, because it's about the strange way in which a merely materialist society, which doesn't believe in rituals, actually imposes new rituals without knowing it, and which are always rituals of death. And that's what we could observe, I think, throughout the last few years. And indeed, the truth, yes. Yes, you can clearly see that there is only one remedy against emerging mass formations and totalitarianism, and that it is to continue to speak out, which inevitably means that you will lose something. So you will have to sacrifice something, because in the world of appearances, inevitably. Because in my analysis, the essence of speaking sincere and of the phenomenon of truth is that it is a kind of speech which penetrates through what I often call the veil of appearances. Like sometimes when a group or society is in the grip of a certain way of thinking or a narrative, sometimes you feel, I actually feel that there is something wrong with that narrative. But you know, if you destroy the illusion, that people who try to find their stability in that illusion will be very angry with you. Ancient Greeks knew that, for instance. They said, like, inevitably, the one who speaks the truth will be hated to a certain extent. And that's the choice you have to make. Am I willing to sacrifice something in the world of illusions? Or not? If you do it, you will lose something. You will, for instance, you will no longer embody the ideal image for other people. That's what I noticed at university, because I spoke out. Most colleagues considered me to be someone who was an anti-vaxxer, someone who was against science, someone who was even a far right-wing fascist or something. Very strange, but inevitably, if you go into the psychology of truth, you can see it. It's inevitable by definition. Speak out in a truthful way, and you will lose something. Even by definition, speaking the truth is speaking from your most vulnerable point. It's speaking in a vulnerable way. It's showing something that is usually hidden behind the outer ideal image. Yeah. It's allowing words, allowing what you feel as something truthful and sincere inside, expressing it, pushing it out through your ideal image. You literally make a hole in your ideal image, and you show something that is usually hidden behind it. That's one aspect of truth speech. A second one is it's not sufficient to show something that is usually hidden to speak the truth. There should be a second characteristic of your speech, and it is that you should speak from the intention to do good for everyone. That were the two characteristics of truth speech in antique Greek culture, for instance. If you speak with a good intention for everyone, and in a vulnerable way, that's where your voice will start to have that ring of truthfulness, I think. And that's the only cure for a society which is sick of lies and manipulation, in which it lapses into mass formation totalitarianism. So that is what happens. Like Gustave Le Bon described that already in the 19th century. He said he was the first major scholar on the phenomenon of the emergence of masses. And he wrote this very small but very important book, The Psychology of the Masses, The Psychology of the Crowds, that's the translation in English, Psychology of the Crowds, in which he describes how when a mass formation emerges in a society, there is always a small group of people who doesn't go along with it. Like, even more, there is only 20 to 30% of the people who is in the grip of the mass formation. But there is always 60% of the people, 65, who sees that there is something wrong with that narrative, but who prefers to remain silent because they think it's too dangerous to speak out. And then there is a small group of people who tries to live up to the most important ethical duty of a human being, namely articulating the words that seem sincere and honest to you. And that small group of people, Gustave Le Bon said in his book, it will always be disappointed and become hopeless because it will see that it cannot convince the masses, that the masses remain blind, that they continue to buy into the narrative. But, Gustave Le Bon said, it's not because these voices cannot wake up the masses that they do not have an effect on the masses. If these people continue to speak out in a quiet way, the masses won't go to the last stage, where they start to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. And since the publication of Gustave Le Bon's book, history has shown us in a wonderful way that he was right. Like, totalitarianism emerged everywhere in the world in the first half of the 20th century. In two places, it developed into a fully fledged totalitarian system. In the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. What happened there? 2 times the same. In 1930, in the Soviet Union, the resistance went underground. They stopped to speak out because they thought it was too dangerous. Within 6 months, the destruction campaign started. In 1935, exactly the same happened in Germany. Stopping to speak out when confronted with mass formation in a totalitarian state is the most fatal thing you can do. In contrast with a classical dictatorship. If in a classical dictatorship, the dictator seizes power and succeeds in silencing the opposition, he will almost always become milder. He will mitigate his aggression. Because just a classical dictator is not hypnotized as a totalitarian leader is. A totalitarian leader hypnotizes the population and is hypnotized himself by his ideology. In a classical dictatorship, the dictator is awake. He has common sense and he knows, I am in control now. Now I will try to show that I am a good leader, because then it will be easier to keep in control. In a totalitarian state, exactly the opposite happens. If a totalitarian leader succeeds in silencing the resistance in the population, then first he unleashes his full aggressive potential. Then he goes completely crazy, wild, he goes completely into hypnosis and starts to be convinced it's my holy duty to destroy them all those who do not go along with it. So that's...
And Hitler did that in Germany. I know he signs this document with, I think, 17,000 churches to essentially say they were no longer going to speak about political issues in the church. And within 6 months, death was starting to take place. All the disabled people were being killed. The slaughter began within months.
I didn't know that,
but then it
fits into the schedule.
So, in conclusion, I mean, there's so much more to talk about. You describe this idea, and Havel does this in his work, where he describes the parallel polis. The idea of building parallel structures in the midst of the totalitarian movement that helps people imagine there is a better way. There's a different way I could live. And perhaps it's designed so those 65% of people that are just kind of watching and in fear imagine there's a different way I can live my life. And if we don't create that, and this is my urgent message to leaders, if we don't create that, especially for Christian leaders, a kingdom mentality of the way God's ordered the world to function. If we don't create that space, then people don't realize there's even any other option. They just are really going to keep going down the path of what's being put right in front of them. And so just help us understand a little more about that parallel structure and polis that needs to be created so that people realize there's another option.
Yes, definitely. I think it all starts with sincere speech, because if people stop to speak out, as I said, the hypnosis will become complete, and parallel structures will be destroyed immediately. And so you need to continue to speak in a quiet way, not trying to convince people, just saying, look, I have a different opinion. I will articulate it. You can do with it what you want, but I will just articulate it. I will not try to convince you. I will just try to testify to what I feel.
Put truth into the world.
Yes, that's the most important thing, because if you don't do that, the parallel structures will be destroyed.
Because the underground movement.
That drive will be so strong in the masses that they will destroy everything that doesn't go along with them.
Yeah.
But of course, and that's just like, and that's sufficient, because a totalitarian system in the end always destroys itself. But the point is, you have to try to make sure that it destroys itself before it destroys you.
Yes.
Or before it destroys all the people who do not go along with it. So speaking out, testifying to what you feel, and so on is the most important thing. But it's not, there should be something more as well, because it's clear, you can see it now already, like the COVID crisis, we didn't go into that, but the COVID crisis was actually the first major step, not the first, but a major leap forward in the emergence of a technocratic surveillance system. And it's clear where it will go to, that system. It will impose a digital ID. And digital coins, a completely digital world. At least that's what this ideology inevitably tries to do. It tries to create a society in which everything can be controlled in a digital way. And you will have the choice, of course. Or at least, at a certain moment, we'll be confronted with a black and white choice. Mm-hmm. Will you accept that digital idea and everything that is associated with it, or not?
Yeah.
And if you choose not to accept it, you will be excommunicated. That's what these systems always do.
Right.
So
that's the next test. The vaccine might have been the first test.
Yes.
But that was preparation, because the next test will be, are you going to operate in this digital control system?
Yes.
That the ID represents that step. And we see that being pushed right now in the world. We see it immediately in the US, driver's licenses called Real ID, that every time you go to renew your license now, they're trying to give you a Real ID saying you're not going to be able to fly on planes. Most people don't know, if you use your passport, if you have a passport, you can use that. You don't have to get the Real ID. You can just continue to get your driver's license. Granted, there's a chip in the passport, so there's still some digital nature to that, but it's not to the extent that this new Real ID is being created. So I encourage everybody I know, don't get the Real ID. Like, you have to keep resisting these things. Just like the vaccine, it doesn't seem popular. It seems like no big deal. It seems like it's not going to harm, but I think I'm hearing you say, red alert, this digital course that we're going down is going to create more controls and the potential for more and more harm to free, loving people.
Yes, of course. It will fail. I think it will fail in the end, but only if there are enough people who resist it, of course.
Yeah.
Enough. There don't have to be so many. A small group of people can and will change the world, I think. Exactly. So, but that's also what we maybe need now. I see everything that happens now. At a certain level, I see it as a big metaphysical revolution in which we move from a society which is in the grip of the illusion that human existence and human living together should be lived on the basis of rational knowledge, to a society which reappreciates the importance of ethical principles, in particular of truth speech. There was so much more we could go into, but that is the true revolution, I think. And the revolution from a society guided by the human hubris of rational understanding to a society which reappreciates, which realizes again, as Max Planck said, to whom we referred in the beginning, that the real world is governed not by causal laws, but by ethical laws. That's a point.
Yeah. Well, Mattias, this has been a great conversation. It's such a privilege to get to talk to you, hear more about your ideas. I'm excited for more and more people to follow along as you continue to do great work in your new book, Psychology of Truth, when that releases in the coming year, for people to pick that up and to continue to follow along with this great thinking. So thank you for being with us.
I enjoyed this conversation, Gabe, and to this extent that I'd love to continue it for 1 or 2 hours.
Yes. We'll do it again
next time.
Yes, next time.
Thank you.